So thank you guys for joining us for this quarter's LCF webinar. As I think most of you guys know, we've been doing these quarterly webinars for local community foundations across the state, and we've kind of bounced around from different topics. We've done some that are more focused on fundraising. We've done some on communications. This past winter, we did one kind of looking at what other community foundations across the state are up to in terms of community leadership projects. And for this quarter, I'm really excited to have a number of special guests to kind of offer their expertise and wisdom, but we're really doing a deep dive into innovative practices in grant making. And we kind of came up with this topic because community foundations across the state, including the Montana Community Foundation, have kind of practiced doing grant making in a variety of different ways. And so first we're going to hear from Eliza Fiaschetti, who's our Impact Program Director and also my boss here at MCF, to talk about kind of like what are general trends in the field of grant making, like how can we reconceptualize and think about grant making as not just kind of this like once a year process that involves like an application process, but are there other types of grant making practices that can be used to inspire like more trust with grantees and build kind of deeper connections and relationships with grantees to still meet our mission as community foundations. And so, yeah, Eliza is going to talk through kind of like what some of those practices and kind of the larger field of philanthropy are. And then we're going to turn it over to Tony with the Greater Polson Community Foundation, who have been doing, I think for a year or two now, some trust-based grants. And she's going to talk about kind of their process as a board on landing on doing trust-based grant making and how that has looked like in practice. And then we're going to hear from Kylie with the Women's Foundation of Montana, who is another one of my colleagues, who's going to talk about their grant making process and what that has looked like for their advisory committee and for grantees. And then we'll have some time at the end for questions from anybody in the audience. So if your community foundation is thinking about any particular grant making hurdles or experimenting with other grant making practices, kind of keep those questions on the back burner. You're welcome to put them into the chat throughout the entire webinar, but we'll also have some explicit time at the end for those. Just a little housekeeping. I think if anybody, if there's some background noise throughout the webinar, I might mute you, but feel free to come off mute at the end. And we'll also be recording this webinar so we can share it with all of our community foundation friends that couldn't make it today. It'll be posted on our website under the LCF toolkit, and then I'll also send it out in case you want to pass it along to any other board members. With that, I'm going to share my screen and turn it over to Eliza. Can everybody see that? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Great. Yeah, I'll turn it over to Eliza to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Taylor. As Taylor mentioned, I am the Impact Program Director here at Montana Community Foundation. I have been in the grant making and the grant world for a long time on the state side, working on federal grants, private, kind of all over the place. So I have a lot of different perspectives of grant making and what that looks like. So today I just kind of want to explore some of the fundamentals of grant making as community foundations and ways the field can evolve to meet current needs. We'll talk about kind of those traditional approaches that Taylor mentioned. Obviously, there's a lot of great benefits to that and some of the limitations and some of the innovative practices that can help us be more responsive and equitable in our grant making. So looking, let's move to the next. Yep, great. So,
and Alexa, you're just a little bit, like I can hear you, but it's a little bit muffled. So I don't know if there's a way to move the microphone a little bit closer. I'm not sure if that's true for anybody else.
I will also talk louder. Is this better?
Yeah, that's a little bit better.
I will also talk loudly. So let me know, interrupt me if I am too quiet. So at the most basic level, grants from a community foundation, from any foundation, must support charitable purposes. This typically means granting to 501c3 nonprofits or government entities. So cities, counties, schools, tribal governments, really by holding that 501c3 status, the IRS has determined that that entity, that activity that the entity does is charitable. So that's kind of the most easiest way to kind of do that charity check. You can also grant to other entities like 501c4s or 501c6s, but it does require some more due diligence, documentation, and oversight to ensure that those funds are used for a charitable purpose. So there's a lot of different options for community foundations for grant making, and we certainly have more flexibility than a lot of other funders, which is really exciting and allows us to be creative in the ways that we support communities and nonprofits. We certainly are exploring that at the Community Foundation, and if you have questions, either after this or after all of this presentation about what types of entities you can and cannot grant to and want any of that guidance, feel free to reach out to us. We don't give legal advice, but we can talk about the work that we do and certainly connect you with folks if there's questions about the legality of what entities you can grant to. Of course, as stewards of the funds that we hold at the foundation, our role is to ensure that the grant dollars are aligned with the charitable intent, the donor's intent, regardless of who the recipient is. So those are just kind of the overarching general rules and responsibilities of our grant making. Of course, we all are required to do that due diligence and ensure, as I mentioned, all of the grants are going to that charitable purpose and supporting organizations. So I want to talk a little bit more about what we might consider traditional grant making. Traditional grant making is what many of us are more familiar with, sometimes more comfortable with. Project-based, one-year grants with formal applications, set deadlines, set and standard reporting requirements. There is absolutely nothing wrong with these sort of traditional practices in grant making. This sort of model really ensures structure and accountability, and it makes a significant impact in the communities and the nonprofits we're supporting. That being said, it's also good to be aware of some of the limitations and also the unintentional reinforcement sometimes of power imbalances, and can be really resource intensive for nonprofits, particularly when we're looking at supporting nonprofits that are in rural communities that have some lower capacity. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with volunteer boards, and just having the time to commit to applications and grant writing and all of that takes a long time. And so sometimes when we think about that traditional grant making, it can be really resource intensive for communities. So really just important to recognize some of the limitations in the model and how we might be able to kind of think outside the box of that traditional model in order to really serve the communities and the populations and those nonprofits that we hope to and that we intend to. So what is the shift? What are we looking at in terms of the philanthropic landscape in the funding world? And so more funders are, including Montana Community Foundation, are looking at shifting our practices to be more responsive to grantees and to the communities that we're serving. Really what they're telling us that they need is flexibility, trust, and long-term support. There's a lot of research out there that shows that unrestricted, flexible funding really increases nonprofit sustainability and allows them to keep providing the services they do, keep their lights on, keep their staff paid. And so being able to look at that and funders looking at that shift of the real need of communities and the real need of nonprofits is important. Looking at things like, and we'll talk a little bit more about participatory models and community-led processes, how those they build trust and transparency and legitimacy to align with the needs of the organizations we're trying to support. I think, the way I try to think about it is often rethinking our role as funders, really as partners in our communities and partners in the work that we are doing. So before, we go into some of those actual emerging trends, I also just want to give a little bit of an overview of Montana's current nonprofit landscape. We want to look at all of this through that lens of where nonprofits are today and how philanthropy can be more responsive to these needs, particularly in this very uncertain time. A recent study, hopefully, if you haven't all seen it, we can certainly send it out after this. The Montana Nonprofit Association and Headwaters Economics did a fantastic study that really gives us a sense of the challenges nonprofits in Montana are facing today and really further emphasizes why we need to think about funding differently. As you can see here, nearly 43% of our nonprofits operate with budgets under 500,000, and 38% of those are rural or are based in rural communities. Despite all of this, only 3% of philanthropic dollars nationally go to rural communities, and less than 1% go to Indigenous communities. Of course, federal funding plays a really big role in our economy, in the work that we do, and many nonprofits are vulnerable if that support dries up or changes, again, in all of this kind of uncertainty of the federal funding landscape. So it really just underscores, I think, the need for grant-making approaches to meet nonprofits, the reality of nonprofits and where they're at. And again, being flexible and allowing for that sustainable funding source for those nonprofits. Thinking about, what does it mean to and look like for funders to be more flexible? So I'm going to just talk through a couple of these emerging trends really within grant making that can help reshape how we think about supporting nonprofits. These are things that, as Taylor mentioned, Montana Community Foundation is doing and continuing to work through and evolve what that looks like, again, in order to be a good partner for the nonprofits we seek to support. So first, looking at trust-based philanthropy, this is really a growing movement that thinks about how funders and grantees work together, and I would say kind of really tries to take away and reduce some of that power imbalance between funder-fundee relationships. It builds, as you can see, on 6 principles, including unrestricted funding, simplified paperwork, and streamlined processes, and then really deepening those relationships. As I mentioned, the goal of really is shifting some of that power, reducing the burden, and focusing on that trust and that relationship with the organization, rather than so much the application and what is presented in an application. And this approach, I would say that this approach is particularly relevant in a lot of smaller communities, rural areas, where relationships, as you all know, are really important and run deep. And so having this kind of this foundation of trust-based philanthropy can be a really great way to think about supporting those nonprofits that that are in your community and is doing very good work. Looking at kind of some of the next, some other trends, participatory grant making really puts decision-making power in the hands of the people that are closest to the issue, whether that's the people in the community or the experts in the field. This is something that we really do and strive to do with all of our grant making here at the Montana Community Foundation. And this might be, as I said, advisory committees of local communities or folks that are in that expert field. For example, we have a handful of different funds. We have a mental health fund. We have a fund about conservation. We have a fund for searching for missing murdered Indigenous people. All of these different things that I don't have the expertise in. I don't necessarily have that landscape view, but we know people that are in the field and doing that work every single day, that are aware of that and can help make those decisions. And so I think, it sometimes can be a little bit more work on the upfront of setting up committees, building all of those. But it really helps, I think, to ensure that the the funding reflects local priorities, certainly increases transparency and continues to build that relationship and ownership. Even small shifts, I think, in how you include the community, how you include experts in those issues can really make a big difference in the grant making. So rethinking, one thing Taylor and I talk about quite a bit is really rethinking the way we all think about supporting general operating and how critical it is for nonprofits. I think traditionally general operating support is really hard to come by and really hard to find, and many funders tend to shy away from that and not allow that. But these funds are really critical for nonprofit. These unrestricted funds help nonprofits cover really the core costs, plan ahead, stay resilient in the work that they're doing. In order to provide the services, in order to do the work that they're doing, they need to be able to keep the lights on and pay their staff. And so those are really critical things that allows grantees to be responsive to the needs within their community without having to try to create something that fits into a project or a program within a grant application, but really allowing them to apply for what they need in order to function as a nonprofit and provide those services that they do for the communities. And then I think really, thinking about, obviously these are not all the emerging trends, but one of the last ones that I wanted to talk about today was really looking at multi-year funding as a long-term partnership, really, and the stability that can help nonprofits with, instead of asking grantees to apply every year. You go through one process, you vetted that organization, they're doing good work, and being able to commit multiple years to a nonprofit really reduces the uncertainty for those nonprofits and allows them to think ahead strategically, invest in staff, invest in their programming, and know that they're going to have funding for 2 years or 3 years or whatever that might be. And so allowing for that multi-year funding where you can is really important. It not only puts less of a burden on the grantees, but it can also be a good way for local community foundations to think about how it can be more efficient for them as well, in terms of not having to go through an annual application or a large annual application every single year. So those are some of the really quickly some of the emerging trends that we at the Community Foundation are trying to practice, as well as looking at the whole philanthropic foundation world that many funders are trying to move towards in order to again be more responsive. I want to share kind of one quick example of some success in combining some of these practices that we have had recently at the Community Foundation. Last year was the first, many of you are probably aware, the first year that the Montana Community Foundation partnered with the Otto Bremer Trust, which is a private trust out of the Twin Cities, to be an intermediate partner to re-grant dollars in Montana. And so we were able to, develop a responsive and flexible program really based on the guidance, the priorities and requirements were all set by the Otto Bremer Trust and the trustees. And then we really looked at what is that landscape in Montana? How can we build a process that allows us to be flexible, allows us to be, again, responsive to organizations we're trying to support. So things we did, we supported operating funding. Organizations could apply for either program or operating funds. We allowed for both because we also know that sometimes you need program funding, and sometimes organizations are more comfortable because that's what they're used to, is applying for programmatic funding. So we allowed for any of that. We also at least tried to make our application process as simple as possible. It takes a lot of time, but we were there, we had a ton of phone calls with people talking about their projects, talking about um, the language that they're using. And so really being able to provide that technical assistance and be accessible to grantees. I think there's often as somebody that has been on the other side and written a lot of grants, there's often that um, feeling that there's maybe a wall up between funders and grantees. And so that you can't just pick up the phone and call a funder and ask those simple questions. And so that's one thing that we really strive to do is kind of have that transparency and that accessibility to staff to ask those questions, whether they're really high level questions about just getting into the application or budget questions. And so I think that really helps, particularly those organizations that might not be familiar with processes. We also used participatory grant making. So last year there were 4 different funding priorities, and so we had 4 different grant committees that reviewed whatever was in their funding priority, reviewed those applications, and that was absolutely instrumental. There is no way we could have done that in-house, nor would we have wanted to. The expertise that folks brought, we had folks from across the state in so many different fields, and the expertise and the knowledge that they brought about the landscape of that field, the landscape of nonprofits, the gaps in funding was so critical to that process and being able to select grantees. The other thing we really did is we rooted our decisions in data, in understanding again that landscape. We use the Headwaters Economics. They have a rural capacity index, and so we really looked at where organizations were based and what communities might traditionally have access to resources and other funding, and which ones lacked that, and where we might be able to provide that support. And then finally, we asked for feedback. We offered feedback to grantees that were not funded, and then we also asked for feedback on our process, because if it works for me sitting here in Helena, it doesn't work for our grantees. That doesn't help. So we really also strive for that kind of feedback loop from our applicants, whether they're funded or not, about how did that process go, in order to again really meet the nonprofits where they're at and provide them the support that they need. So I'm happy to, I think that these approaches are often scalable, and you can adapt them to your foundation size, your resources, your goals. And it doesn't have to be at once. It doesn't need to be perfect, but just kind of, I think, moving towards being responsive to nonprofits and to communities can make a really big impact in that grant making. So happy to answer any questions, or if Taylor, you want me to leave everything till the end, I will just go on mute and hang out till the end.
Yeah, Liza, I think if we can save all of our questions to the end, that'll work well, if you don't mind hanging on. But thanks for setting the context of like kind of how the philanthropic and grant making field is like slightly shifting, right? Like I think that that's the power of being in the philanthropic community, right? Like, we have a lot of flexibility with our funding. And so our funding practices and our grant making practices can change over time. And so I loved your point of, right, like there's ways to incorporate just 1 or 2 of these small pieces, or to test out maybe some more trust-based practices to build more of a relationship with grantees, to make sure that it works for both grantees and for community foundations. So with that, I'm excited to turn it over to Tony, because Greater Polson Community Foundation is doing just that. They run kind of an annual regular grant making process, and then they've also started doing these trust-based grants. So Tony's going to tell us kind of how that's gone, and what that process has been like for their board.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Great. So thank you for asking us. We are really proud of our trust-based grant program. We've been doing this since 2020, and we started out realizing that we really needed to help our nonprofits more than just our impact grants, but we needed to help them throughout the year with other things. So these are unrestricted, and they are by invitation only. And we work very carefully. Our grants committee chooses who they want to meet with, and we split up who we are thinking that we're going to use as our trust-based grant people. And we actually go in and interview them and fill out a different set of form and information than what we do for our impact grants. So it's a much more streamlined process. So we choose nonprofits that have worked with the foundation for several years, and where our foundation understands and values that nonprofit's contribution to our mission. They can be for a regular grant and also for the trust-based grant. They are not project specific, and they can be used for general operating purposes. There are times when, some of these nonprofits, like you said, are operating on a very slim margin, and they need help with, maybe not salaries, because everybody around here works for nothing. So it's just for things that they really need help with. And like I said, it's a shorter application form. And our trust-based grants, we started out with only a small amount of money, but they are now up to $3,000 a year is what we give out. And I believe we gave out, what was it, 11 or 12 this year?
36,000.
We gave 36,000 in February. We try to do, we have really special cards that we give to these. We do the interviews in January, and then we give a special card that says we love our nonprofits, because we really do. We want them to succeed, because it just helps our community that much more. So we try to get pictures of them, as we are giving them their Valentine. Actually, we do it for Valentine's Day. So they're so excited to get that, because they don't really have to do hardly anything. We do all the back work. Our committee does all of the legwork, and answers all the questions throughout the interview process and stuff. And we have quite an interview list of 10 questions that we fill out, and I don't think I can show you that very easily, but we could share that with you. And that just says the organization's name and address, their 501c3 number, the year they were organized and founded, what their mission statement is, so we make sure that it coincides with our mission statement. A paragraph that describes the positive impact that their organization has on the greater Polson community. What grants they have received from us in recent years. Their most recent profit and loss statement, or their financial statement. A list of their board of directors, the officers of the board, and any staff that might be employed. And then the contact person who is applying for the grant from us. And then the last thing on there is what date and which grant committee member actually met with that person. So I think all of that's really important to know all that. So we have a really good, clear track mechanism of who we've met with and what our thoughts are before we actually give them that money. Polson's nonprofit sector adds a tremendous value to our community's well-being, and it has for years. So recognizing the importance of these and other the organizations, we added that trust-based program in 2020. So I just feel like it's so important to give that kind of money to these organizations to help them when they might not be floundering, but they might still need a boost up. So and that gives them money year round. We've switched our impact grants from being in the spring to now being in the fall. So we give those out before Thanksgiving, and then we give out the trust-based grants, as I said, for Valentine's Day. So that gives them a better balance of funding throughout the year, which might help them a whole lot more. One of the things that we also do is the participatory grant making. I think since about 2015, we have been doing a special program with the aquatic center, so that the second and third graders get swimming safety lessons. They get 8 days worth of swimming safety lessons throughout in the year. And we have been funding that, not 100%, because we feel like the pool needs to pay for part of that, but we do pay. We do that in 3-year segments where we have it already set aside, and that way, because we have this big lake right outside our door and lots of streams and rivers, we feel like it's very important for these kids to learn safety, and we have huge feedback from the kids and their families that it's a very worthwhile project, and we hope to continue that forever and ever, I guess. So I think that the biggest takeaway from that is that with these trust-based grants, it really requires our foundation committees to interact more carefully and more thoroughly with organizations on a regular basis, and to keep in touch with community needs, because we can lose track very easily of what the community needs are. And our purpose really is to partner with and encourage the organizations that serve Polson's well-being. So does that give you a really good insight onto what we do?
Yeah, that's
And
fantastic, Tony. And I'm sorry I miscredited. I thought it had been only a couple of years, but since 2020, that's an impressive kind of five-year period now. I have one really quick follow-up question. How do you guys think through like which organizations you want to invite to apply for the trust-based grants? Are there certain kind of considerations you have, like they play a certain role in the community, or yeah, what's kind of like the consideration process there?
any and all above. It's people that we have had a relationship with before, somebody that we have a track record with, that we know what they do, what they have done, what they're proposing to do. And it's to help them keep their feet on the ground. You have anything to add to that, Jen?
Well, I mean, sometimes, the organizations, the nonprofits that we work with, like Tony had mentioned, sometimes you just need to keep your lights on, and depending on how things are going in the grant writing world or funding world. So we just thought it was really important to show that the trust that we have in these nonprofit organizations in our area, that we know they're doing the good work, and we're just throwing our trust at them that they are going to do what they need with that small amount of money. And we're hoping to add to that as we go along, so.
That's fantastic. And I love that they're Valentine's Day cards, right? Like what a lovely way to, right? Even just like so cute. And it's such a small way of like flipping the power imbalance, right? Of like, "Oh, we're just so appreciative of what you guys do in your community." So awesome.
Everyone handy.
I have a new one. You have one.
So Jen's got one of our new ones, so I didn't bring that stuff with me, so, but they're just really cute and clever, and we are very grateful to have Jen who comes up with these ideas for us.
Perfect.
This is this year's. We went a little fancier. It says we love our nonprofit, and then on the inside, it just gives them a nice note that we appreciate all the hard work that they do to make Polson the greatest community in Montana.
Nice. Fantastic. And are you guys able to stay on till the end of the hour just to see if anybody has questions?
Sure. Yeah,
Okay,
I can.
great. Okay, well then we'll hold off questions until then. And the next person that I'm going to invite to speak is Kylie Gursky with the Women's Foundation of Montana. If I can find Kylie and pin her on my screen. There you are.
And if you can leave me unpinned for just a minute, I
Oh,
have
yeah.
a question for everybody. First of all, thanks for inviting me to chat with folks, Taylor and Tony and Jen. I would have to agree, Polson is the greatest community in Montana, having been born and raised there in Polson. And it was before the aquatic center, but I do remember summer after summer after summer of swimming lessons so that my mom felt comfortable with me going down to the park. So such a critical thing to be supporting in your community. I love it. I am curious for the folks who are here, either on screen or if you're off screen, you can use the little reaction. I'm curious how many of you have written grants, have been fund seekers yourselves. Yep, we've got some hands. We've got some hands. Me too. Me too. Yes, I love it. So I'm curious if you want to share like maybe one or two things, practices that you've benefited from, or maybe you wish you would have benefited from funders who have been excellent partners for you. And you can just either write it in the chat or toss it out. I'm just curious to hear what people's experiences have been.
I'm happy to go. Claire in Sealy Lake. I have really appreciated site visits from funders. I think it's so powerful to get people in the door and be able to talk in person and tour around our facility. And it takes so much time and effort for people to get up to Sealy Lake, and that always feels really lovely when funders make that effort.
I love it. Thanks for sharing, Claire. And somebody also shared in the chat, Town Pump Foundation makes it so easy to apply for their grants. I've done grants for the library and Kid Pack programs. So yeah, easy application process. Folks come in to visit you on your turf. Continued interest and support, site visits, and knowledge of the organization. So actually caring enough to know a little bit about you and your work before they show up or consider evaluating you for funding. All of these are awesome, and I think they represent like the sincere desire to have a relationship with the organizations that are doing good work in communities. So their sort of practices with you guys have all been on the receiving end of sort of what it's like to have a good partnership with a funder. And I imagine if I asked, what have been some like less than admirable practices that you've seen, you guys would be able to fill the chat also with that. So I think there's just lots of different experiences that we all have about what it actually looks like to be a good partner. And Tony talked about lots of the trust-based philanthropy practices that they're using in Polson. And I'm just going to share a few of what the Women's Foundation has been doing in the last couple of years. And then, as Taylor said, available for any questions, and just looking forward to the discussion after the presentation. But I will share that sometimes what I've heard from grantees and what I've experienced myself is that foundations can approach the funding process almost as if we are contracting nonprofit entities to do work that we want to see done. And it might be a bit more of a government approach than we want to bring to community-based philanthropy. So how do we sort of shake off some of that, we're contracting you to do specific work practices, and speak to what Jen talked about, and Tony talked about, which is like, how can we really show you that we understand the value that you bring to our societies or to our communities, and that we trust that you're going to do good work, and we just want to be a good partner with it. So I'm going to talk about some practices from the Women's Foundation, and the first one is participatory grant making. So the Women's Foundation was established with an advisory committee, which directs our grant making, as I'm sure all of your organizations also have. But we pull volunteers from across the state to participate in our grant making and empower them to really shape our strategy and then direct our grant making. And the way that I like to put our advisory committee together is being really mindful about the perspectives and experiences that are in the room, and then encouraging the committee to be mindful of the perspectives and experiences that are not in the room when we go into the decision-making process. So we've got folks from all over the state who are happily, for me, willing to travel to come to advisory committee meetings that we hold here in Helena, and sometimes we also go other places in the state to host meetings. But I'm mindful about having representation from some of the farthest corners in our state. So we've got some representation from Eureka and Libby area, some from Sydney. We've got a lot of representation on the Highline, and when our committee gets together, they really talk about Highline Pride, which makes me really happy that they feel like they've got some specific sort of knowledge and power that they're bringing to the process, because you can sort of see it in the way that they talk about the organizations and the work that's being done on the Highline. And it's special to see themselves being in a position of power and being represented. But then, of course, we allocate funding all over the state. So just want to share that. I think the thing that I bring in terms of thinking about participatory philanthropy is that I used to work for an organization called Penny Harvest, which engaged young people in philanthropy, and did a lot of sort of what we've been talking about here, which is thinking about the power dynamic of putting kids in the position of being decision makers about what money does. And while sometimes that can border on condescending when you're thinking sort of how do we flip the power dynamic and put kids in power, but it really did put them in the driver's seat, and I learned so many valuable things from those young people about how they see community issues and the types of things that they want to address, that I feel like that has informed so much of my philanthropy and how I put teams together to make decisions, and then really let them really grapple with some of the problems that they're trying to solve, and some of the big questions that come up in a grant making and funding process. Let's see. So the next thing I want to talk with you all about is what the Women's Foundation is doing in terms of general operating and multi-year funding. When I came into the Women's Foundation about 4 years ago, one of my top priorities was to figure out how we could make bigger grants, provide more general operating, and then eventually get us to multi-year commitments. And I'm sure as all of you are working on these big projects, you realize that changes like that, it really can be like steering a large ship, because those are big changes for organizations that have been either limited in staff capacity or the ability to make grants out. But also just who've been doing things the same way for lots of years. So it's, you kind of have to work to get everybody on board for those changes. So we've made the general operating change and funding more general operating was probably the easiest one to make. I think there's arguments there about that other people have spoken to about the need for our organizations and our communities to have that kind of flexible support. It's also a signal of trust to those organizations that we know you're going to use this in the best, most fitting way for your needs at the time. The other thing is it also relieves administrative capacity on your end. So there's sort of a win-win with general operating, in that you don't have to get into the weeds too much as a funder. You don't have to request too much reporting, but you can just say, we trust you, here's this general operating grant. It's okay if it goes to pay people, because that's who's doing the work. So we want it to keep the lights on. We want it to pay for salaries, because that is the energy that it takes for us to make a difference in our communities. So that's some of the general operating sort of rationale that we used. We do provide some project-specific funding because of, and some of you might have programs where your impact area is more narrow. So for the Women's Foundation, the way that we've done that is we've provided funding that might fund a particular program. So for example, at the North Valley Food Bank, they have postpartum meal kit program that they operate. And so what we said is, it's our funding is restricted to this program, but within that program, it can pay, whatever salaries or whatever rental space is associated with that. So we do target some of our funding sometimes because we are looking at women's issues. But within that, we try to provide as much flexibility as we can. For multi-year, this has been incremental for us, trying to build in the capacity to make multi-year grants. And sometimes the thing that gets in the way of that can just be structural. Like we only have our distribution available once a year, and so we get it all out. And we don't want to sort of keep it in the bank. We want it out there doing good work in the community. So we allocate our entire distribution. And then that sort of, it ties our hands in terms of making multi-year commitments. What we've worked to build is strategic partnerships, though, with other funders and donors, so that we can be in a position, if we get multi-year commitments from them, in order to do regranting that we can then make multi-year commitments out to our grantees. The other way that we have worked toward being a reliable funder, but maybe not being able to do multi-year commitments, is working with organizations and telling them it's our intention to renew this funding, and so that they can be a little less sort of on shaky ground, but that our intention is to renew the funding should we have it available. So that doesn't create quite as much stability for them on the books, but it creates more stability and trust in our relationship, and that can help in other ways. And let's see, I made a few notes here about general operating and multi-year grants. And the other thing that I just want to highlight about general operating is there's so much hesitation in the funding world to fund grassroots advocacy work or lobbying. And as community foundations, we actually, and Taylor, you'll have to correct me if I'm misspeaking, but we actually can fund advocacy work. Private foundations are much more limited in what they can do, but we have found so many of the organizations that we work with, particularly organizations who receive federal or state funding, are so limited in what they can do in engaging in advocacy. So, for example, we fund domestic and sexual violence services of Carbon County, which are located in Red Lodge. And because so much of their funding is federal, there's just such a limited amount of time that they can spend on going to Helena, on contacting their legislator. And the thing that they told us is general operating from the Women's Foundation is what allowed them to build a relationship with their legislator in their district. And the outcome of that has been so powerful. Last session, they advocated in front of a committee for additional resources for victim services programs from the state budget. And at the end of the hearing, or in the hearing, I've been told, all of the men in that committee hearing got up and walked out of the room when they were hearing that bill. And that is what happened in 2023. And in 2025, because Domestic and Sexual Violence Services of Carbon County built a relationship with their legislator, who's a Republican woman from that area, that committee stayed in that room and listened to those advocates and then voted in support of allocating funding to community-based victim services programs. And it's the flexible funding that they got from us that allowed them to do the work that they really needed to do and leveraged $4 million from the state. So much more than we would ever be able to grant, but we put them in a position of being able to leverage that. And it's just a powerful example of what kind of impact general operating funding can have. And the last thing I will share just in the last minute, Taylor, and then I promise I'll wrap up, is just some other ways that the Women's Foundation has tried to make ourselves more accessible. So we allow organizations to submit reports via Zoom, and we'll take notes on the reports as they're sort of talking about their outcomes, their challenges. It takes a little bit of the stress off a written report, and it provides a lot more nuance to the work to be able to do reporting in a conversational way rather than just on paper. We also, one of the things that's involved in participatory grant making is that because you've got a group full of volunteers that are making grants, the other side of that is that it's important for us to provide training so that they are the best grant makers that they can be. So the thing that we do is we invite grantees that we have a good relationship with in to do training on issues that are related to their work with our committee. So it puts the grantees in this sort of relationship of authority, in a position of saying, we've got something to teach you. And so they get to give back to the committee with the information and expertise that they have to offer. And it sort of provides more accessibility to the Women's Foundation, to the people that are in a decision-making position, and it makes us better grant makers. And one of the things that we did this session, it sounds a little bit like what Tony and Jen are engaging in, is we took the approach of helping organizations sort of cultivate applications is the language that we use to talk about it. So as an example, we received an application from an organization, Plenty Doors Community Development Corporation in Crow Agency, who has been a previous grantee, is a great partner, and submitted an application that I just was like, this is kind of off the mark. It might not be the most competitive or the strongest application for the committee and for our process. So I picked up the phone and I called Charlene and I said, how do you feel about sort of reworking some elements of this? Like, tell me what's going on here. Let's figure out how to talk about your goals in a way that is really going to shine in our process. Because I knew that her work had more depth and there was more to it than the application that we had received. So proactively sort of picking up the phone and saying, can we work together on this, was another element that we added this year to really put the organizations in the best possible position that they could be in to receive support from the Women's Foundation. So there's a lot more I could share, but I'll cut it off there and hand it back to Taylor. And yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks so much, Kylie. Yeah, so it's so fun to hear about all of the various ways in which you guys are approaching grant making. And I feel like even just in hearing about Greater Polson and the Women's Foundation, right, it sparks so many more ideas for myself. So I'm going to put some resources up on the screen briefly, but I'm going to send all of these out to folks. And so with our last 10 minutes or so, 8 minutes, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And I guess I'm just curious from folks that are here today, like, are there any questions that you have for either Eliza, Tony and Jen, or Kylie? Is this bringing up any questions or thoughts that you guys have about your own grant making processes? Again, like, I think that this is the really exciting piece of being in like a local community foundation and in philanthropy. There's so much flexibility to what you can do with your grant making programs, and they're all kind of like in a state of evolving. So yeah, just open it up to questions or thoughts or comments.
I had a question for
Yeah.
Tony. So Tony, as you look at these trust-based grant programs, have you figured out little niches that you want to invest in? As an example, I wrote down kids, sports, arts, education. Do you have money that you allocate by a specific segment, or it's just whatever comes to people's attention that year?
It's just pretty much what comes to people's attention and what they're working on. We don't specifically, most of our programs are for kids and then arts and stuff, but we don't do it. We don't specifically allocate an exact amount of money that goes just to one thing. So it's just a big pool that we choose from, which ones we want to fund more than others.
Mm-hmm.
And some, we did take some off that we felt like, our focus has changed a little bit, their focus has changed a little bit. So, we're constantly evolving and looking at that.
Great question.
Thank you.
Ooh, okay. I'm seeing one in the chat from Leanne for Kylie. What age of kids did you engage with for the participatory grant making? How did you select them? Yeah, and I think that's a great idea, right? Like, lots of opportunities for local community foundations to engage, especially if you're funding, right? Like youth-based programs, youth in your community. Yeah.
Yeah, we worked with elementary to middle school kids. There's a program called Penny Harvest. There's probably still curriculum out there. There's curriculum for teachers out there. And it was a school-wide program and then had a leadership body of I don't know, 12 kids or so. The Women's Foundation will also be doing a Young Women's Initiative. We got a partnership from another funder to engage young women in philanthropy, and they identify young women as 12 to 24. So quite an age range in that program also.
And I'll just share too, Stevensville Community Foundation has 2 high schoolers that they have sit on their board, specifically kind of to give input about grant making programs for youth in their community, because a lot of their other board members are not high school students, so a little bit older in life, and they're just curious about like, yeah, like if we want to fund, you know, the baseball organization in town or the backpack program, like what do youth in our community kind of think about those various priorities? So just another idea.
I have a question, I guess for Tony and Polson, and that is around wearing hats. I imagine that in Polson, or just can you talk about navigating people being on the committee versus having lots of interests in town, and how you set the stage for committee members and hearing from a variety of folks in the invite only process?
We have we have a committee of about 13 who are on our grants committee. And we have a list of all of the different grantees that we have had over the years. And then they can choose who they want to go and interview. And it's, some of them have a passion for one organization over another. They may be on that board or probably not, but they have a relationship with that organization. So they choose to go and interview that organization. Does that answer your question, or did I not answer?
Yeah. And did you mention it was just kind of 1 or 2 people who go on the site visit, or does the whole committee go, or just a few people go and report back?
It's that each person chooses 1 or 2 organizations to meet with, and then they answer all these questions as they're sitting together, and then bring that back, and then we read through them as a committee and decide how we want to fund them, or if we do want to fund them.
Awesome. I think Leanne had another question in the chat. So Leanne's with Cut Bank Community Foundation. And maybe I should have given you a warm introduction at the beginning because they're our newest community foundation that we're partnering with. And so it's so lovely to have you guys on the call. And they've just reached their fundraising goal like within a couple of months and raised $7,500 for their endowment. And so we're providing $5,000 through the LCF Plus program for them to do their first round of grant making this year. So Leanne's question was for a community foundation that's just starting out, are there any helpful do's and don'ts from the group, especially since it's their first time awarding grants? And yeah, maybe we can start, Tony, with you. If there's any do's and don'ts from Greater Polson's long history of grant making. Yeah, if Irene or Claire or anybody else on the call from an LCF has thoughts, feel free to pop in.
Greater Polson Community Foundation started in 2008, and I actually wrote a grant application to them in 2009 for baby blankets. And so I know they had very little money at that point. And so I think there were only 4 or 5 of us that got grants that very first year. But I think that they were, and I was not affiliated with the organization until 2010. I became a volunteer in 2010. And then joined the board in 2011. But I think it's just, you know, as you see the needs, and you have to have a filter out within the community to find out what the community needs and what they want. And we had done a very intensive program in 2013 and 14 to find out what did the community want from us. And so that might have been easier if we had a little bit smaller community. We're not that big of a community, but it was a huge project. Oh, and Jennifer's got something too, so.
Well, and I was just gonna suggest to Leanne that when you guys start, sometimes in the application process for your nonprofits that are going to apply to you, I would try to keep it as simple as you can. I know that you enroll with it each year, you know, your application process for this year may look a lot different for next year. Just be willing to know that, you know, sometimes you're gonna have to slim it down. I feel like when we started in our application process, it was very convoluted and we asked for a lot for kind of a small amount of money. So I think there has to be a balance there and like realistically, what are we giving them, you know, up to 5,000, up to 10,000 or whatever. I mean, make the work worth the effort. And not kill a bunch of trees in the process.
You have to be flexible.
Yeah.
You really have to be
That's a
flexible.
great point, flexibility.
I love that. Yeah, right, like right sizing the application to the award. And I'm sure if we ask Greater Polson Community Foundation nicely, they might even share their grant application process with Cut Bank or application itself. Irene, I saw that you came off mute. Any thoughts from
Yes.
Forsyth?
So we just had ours, and what I saw is that the applications weren't completely filled. So maybe having a training session or something with the community that's gonna give you information what we're looking for in the application, you know. And I think the other thing, a few people applied for stuff and they didn't have any funding, any other funding, and I think that was important. One of the things we looked at is like, well, who else is helping them with this project? So something to look at is just my comments, because I've been on 2 years, so it's not like I have a lot of knowledge, but what I've seen the last couple of years is really the application process and just having some training out there and or getting back to them as when they submit their application, say, well, that's good, but you don't have your references or you don't have your funding, or you know, your description is not very well written or something to that effect. That's what I saw.
Well, Irene, and this is Jennifer from the Greater Polson. We started offering an annual grant writing workshop, and we just had it like over lunch, and we were actually providing like a real small brown bag lunch. We ended up having to move it online, obviously, when COVID hit. And we were finding a lot of people, the same people were coming, and that kind of instituted why we started the trust-based grants too, because we had so many of the repeat. But the grant writing workshops are really, really helpful. And I mean, you can actually go step by step through your own application. And that seems to help weed out, I guess, any questions and that sort of thing. So your grant applicants are knowing what you expect from them before they even submit their grant applications. And that helps the grant administrator before we have to turn everything over to the grant committee. Like, you know, the people were not following the directions, and, you know, they didn't have the right amount of copies, or their information was not there. They don't even make it to the next round, you know, and that's a hard truth. And then, so I think the grant writing workshops are really, really helpful.
And
That's great.
Jennifer does bend over backwards by offering them an extra week before the grants are, the applications are due, so that they can come in and meet with her and say, okay, did I fill out all these requirements? Did I answer all these questions correctly? You know, what am I missing? That kind of thing. And some of them never make it, and some of them go back and fix theirs, and it's all good.
Great thoughts. It's also, I'm noticing that it's 3 minutes after 1. So if anybody needs to pop off, we will not be offended. But we're happy to stay on for, or I should say, I'm happy to stay on for another minute or two more. If anybody else has thoughts or questions for the group. Bye, Claire.
This is Carly again. I had a couple curiosity questions. Has anybody gotten where they've been asked to partner with somebody else to be able to provide an even greater resource, like two organizations partnering together to build capacity for someone or meet a need that has come up?
Yeah, we have a matching fund that we do. So if somebody comes up with part of the money, and then we do a match, and that if they can raise X number of dollars toward that goal, then we will match it for them. So we do that fairly often. In fact, we got one today that we are probably going to do. Jennifer and I haven't had a chance to talk to it. It just came to my email this morning. So, yeah, it's that we do that a lot.
Do you see, are the matching funds coming from family foundations
Only
or just
rarely do
individuals?
individuals.
Yeah,
Indi-
okay.
Any other final questions? Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for spending your lunch hour and 5 minutes with us. And big thank you to Eliza, Tony, and Jen, and Kylie for sharing your guys' expertise and experience with grant making. As I mentioned, I'll send out the recording, so feel free to pass it along to any other board members or friends in the community foundation world. And I'll send out a lot of the resources that we talked about, along with contact information for those folks that spoke today, just in case you have any follow-up questions. And with that, I wish you a lovely rest of your Wednesday. So nice to see everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Great job, Tony.